Hey everyone, this is Pete, and I like Idea Factory games. I realise this is enough to get me completely ostracised from the cool kids club of people who write about modern games, but frankly I don't care for two reasons. One, Idea Factory games, especially those from their Compile Heart sub-brand, have got me through some seriously tough times in my life, which is probably a story for another day. And two, their modern stuff is considerably better than a lot of their most vocal critics like to make out. A huge turning point for them was when Compile Heart established the Galapagos RPG project back in 2013. This began with the PlayStation 3 RPG Fairy Fencer F and went on to establish itself as a loosely affiliated series of games that, for the most part, don't have any direct connections with one another besides their design philosophy. Galapagos RPG was initially announced as a label which would put out RPGs specifically designed for Japanese customers. This wouldn't necessarily preclude them from coming west, and indeed every entry in the series has been localised so far, but rather make it clear that Galapagos RPG releases would be designed with a laser focus on their target audience. To be fair, this was nothing new for Compile Heart, whose anime-style RPGs, particularly those in the satirical Neptunia series, had already won them something of a cult following prior to the establishment of Galapagos RPG. But once the Galapagos RPG titles started coming out, it became clear that the design philosophy ran deeper than simply making games that were unashamedly Japanese. These were games for grown-ups. By that, I don't mean that they're sexually explicit or anything like that. For starters, the company's primary focus on console gamers precludes them from doing anything like that, and besides, their earlier titles had already had a touch of saucy fan service here and there anyway. If anything, the Galapagos RPG titles are some of Compile Heart's least fan-servicey titles, instead focusing on telling thought-provoking, compelling stories that often dip into rather uncomfortable territory. For example, the aforementioned Fairy Fencer F explores themes of alcoholism, codependence, and the concept of love enduring even after a partner suffers horrible disfiguring injuries. Omega Quintet tackles the concept of attempting to bring hope to a world that has already been utterly ruined beyond repair. And Death End Request 2, which we're looking at today, opens with a scene of the main character being abused by her father, culminating with her murdering him. Death End Request 2, as the name suggests, is the sequel to Death End Request, but the connections between the two might not be immediately apparent. While the first game in the series combined the story of a virtual reality MMO gone mad with horror influences from a variety of sources, Death End Request 2 initially appears to play things as much more straight horror. This is clearly a deliberate choice, because it means that those who are new to the series can jump right into Death End Request 2 without feeling lost, while a second playthrough adds a variety of additional scenes to the mix that connect directly to the revelations from the end of the first game. I won't spoil these here for the sake of those who haven't played it, but suffice to say the game feels much more understandable as a sequel after that second playthrough. And that second playthrough is simple enough to whiz through with the game's New Game Plus mode, allowing you to carry over all your levels, items and equipment to the second run, as well as skip scenes you've already seen. In Death End Request 2, you take on the role of Mai Toyama, the aforementioned abused teen who murdered her father. Freed of any criminal responsibility after it's judged she acted in self-defense, Mai heads to an orphanage somewhere in deepest, darkest Eastern Europe after learning her estranged sister was last seen there. Upon arrival at Wordsworth, as the combined all-female orphanage and academy is known, it becomes immediately apparent that all is not quite right. No one appears to have any concept of modern technology, no one seems to have seen Mai's sister, and there's a distinctly menacing atmosphere in the air, not helped by Mai immediately being targeted by school bully Vina. Mai finds solace in her new roommate, the unusually named Rotten Dullheart, who is the daughter of the imposing headmistress Midra. Rotty, as she prefers to be known, is immediately sympathetic to Mai even without knowing the full details of her past. And to her credit, even when those details come to light later, she still stands with her friend. Mai, having the typically sort of closed-off personality and mistrust of others that comes from enduring a considerable period of abuse, is initially resistant to Rotty's advances, but gradually starts to open up as it becomes clear that the two can trust one another, and by the conclusion of the game the two are shown to be extremely close, perhaps even romantically involved. Implied yuri, or homosexual female relationships, is common in anime-style RPGs, but it's quite rare for it to be specifically acknowledged that two girls are together outside of romantic visual novels where a yuri pairing is the main focus. There are exceptions. Knights of Azure from Gust is a great example, but in many cases girl-girl relationships are sort of laughed off, with the characters being too embarrassed or giggly to confirm anything once and for all. This at least in part stems from changing attitudes towards homosexuality in Japan. While Yuri and Yaoi, homosexual female and male fictional material respectively, have both existed for some time, for many years up until quite recently, there's been the sense that mainstream Japanese culture has somewhat frowned upon same-sex relationships. To get into the socio-political history of Japan is rather beyond the scope of this video, but suffice to say for the moment that there's been a marked shift in anime and game characters being out and proud over the course of the last decade or so in particular, and that's very much a good thing. And it's relevant to Death End Request too, because not only is the story about the developing relationship between Mai and Roti, it also depicts several of the other girls from Wordsworth as being involved with one another to varying degrees, often with a considerable amount of tension in their relationship. And that tension tends to feed into the more horrific aspects of the game. The majority of Death End Request 2's story is told through visual novel sequences, which is part of the unashamedly Japanese angle that Galapagos RPG runs with. This obviously won't be to everyone's taste, because it means that vast swathes of the game are nothing but reading and listening to voice acting. But as any visual novel enthusiast will tell you, it's a good way to really get inside the heads of the characters and understand what's going on with them. Particularly as, unlike many other RPGs that incorporate visual novel style storytelling sequences, we get some internal monologue and narration from Mai alongside the dialogue. The game is fully voiced in both Japanese and English. My personal preference is for the Japanese, which is well acted, though often quite exaggerated in tone as in many anime style works. There are some particularly horrific death scenes throughout the game, in which you can actually hear the point where the victim in question transitions from feeling intense pain and terror to losing their grip on their own mortality. These scenes are rarely visually explicit. The most you might see is some blood splatters covering the screen, but sound is a whole other matter. Consider yourself, and anyone you live with, warned. There are occasional choices to make in the game, but in almost every case these are a binary decision between one of the titular death ends, which leads to a game over where you can thankfully rewind to the last decision point even if you haven't saved, and a choice which allows you to proceed with the story. In a few cases, however, they have more subtle impacts, such as deciding whether secondary characters live or die. There's nothing that affects the direction the main plot of the game goes in, but once those secondary characters are dead, they're well and truly gone for the rest of the playthrough, meaning you'll miss out on any scenes that involve them. Like its predecessor though, there is a certain amount of incentive to check out all the possible scenes, including the death ends, because the in-game story summary screen offers rewards for every unlocked event. And in the case of death ends, that reward is often a powerful piece of equipment for one of the playable characters. The equipment, of course, relates to the RPG scenes, which occur as the last part of each in-game day. After you're sure you've seen all the character events you want to, you'll trigger the end of day event, which leads into the actual RPG action when the clock strikes midnight. It's the first time you encounter one of these RPG sequences that it becomes clear there's definitely something more going on in the sleepy, technologically backward setting of the game. The world post-midnight is twisted and distorted, with strange growths bursting forth from ruined buildings, the complete absence of any human beings walking the streets or inhabiting the houses, and of course, monsters. In each RPG sequence you're given a key objective to accomplish, which pretty much always boils down to reach a specific point on a particular map. With the game being split into discrete days that are tied to the narrative rather than an actual time mechanic, you'll find that early forays don't take you very far, and indeed areas that will be too dangerous for you at the time will be completely blocked off, but the deeper into the game you go, the more freeform the exploration becomes. The geographical area over which the game unfolds is relatively small, but this is in keeping with the nature of the narrative. It's a small-scale story that focuses on a forgotten little town that doesn't appear on any maps, so it makes sense that you're not wandering a vast world, instead confining yourself to the town streets and surrounding environs such as farmland, lakeside and mountain areas. It also helps keep the RPG sequences focused, which in turn allows the narrative to continue flowing at a good pace. Again, this is an unashamedly Japanese aspect of the game that may not be to everyone's taste, particularly those who prefer the more freeform nature of Western-style RPGs. But within the context of how the game as a whole is structured, it makes a lot of sense. For those who want some additional things to do, after the first couple of chapters of the game, optional side quests become available. On your first playthrough, these are worth doing for the rewards they provide. On a second playthrough, meanwhile, many of these unlock additional events that add extra depth to the story, particularly if you're familiar with the first game. The side quests themselves are fairly mundane and aren't given any real narrative context, though thankfully very few of them involve grinding for rare item drops. Most involve seeking out and defeating a specific mini-boss or recovering specific treasures from an area, which are in predefined locations. While it's a shame they're not integrated into the narrative a little more effectively, they do at least provide a reason to explore the game's mechanics more thoroughly. And the mechanics, specifically the combat mechanics, are a highlight of Death End Request 2, much as with its predecessor. The two have a lot in common, but differ in their implementation. While the first Death End Request featured a variety of different mechanics that could be employed in various situations, Death End Request 2 pares them down to the bare essentials and refines them somewhat. Both have their distinct appeal, even if Death End Request 2 might initially appear to have slightly less complexity than its predecessor. Death End Request 2's combat is turn-based and unfolds on a separate battle screen. As with most Compile Heart RPGs, the game features a symbol attack system where you can start combat with an advantage or disadvantage depending on whether you get a hit in on an enemy on the field screen or if they manage to sneak up on your backside while you're not paying attention. Again, like most Compile Heart RPGs, Death End Request 2's combat features free movement, and it plays a particularly important role here, as we'll see in just a moment. On each character's turn, they can take up to 3 actions, described as a triact. These actions can be anything the character is capable of: basic attacks, special abilities, using items or defending. This means it's possible to dish out damage and protect yourself in a single turn, or buff yourself, then use that buff to deliver a particularly devastating hit. Strategically using these 3 available actions in a turn becomes increasingly important as the game progresses, as the encounters ramp up considerably in difficulty towards the latter half of the story. As with the first Death End Request, characters and abilities in Death End Request 2 have an element attached to them. There's just 3 to worry about in a triangular arrangement: moon beats sun, sun beats star, star beats moon, though some enemies do have significantly more physical or magical defense, meaning you also need to pay attention to damage type for the strongest hits. Probably of greater importance in using the correct damage type and element, however, is the game's knockback system. This was one of the most distinctive features of the original Death End Request, though its effectiveness lessened considerably as the game progressed. Here, however, it is of critical importance, particularly in the late game. If a character delivers 3 basic attacks in a row, or uses at least 1 skill in their triact with the knockback property, they'll add a 4th attack in their turn which, as the name suggests, knocks the enemy back. The exact distance they go varies according to their hidden weight stat, and indeed some enemies are completely unmovable, requiring different tactics to deal with. Knockback is important because if an enemy bumps into something while it's being knocked back, it takes additional damage. If it gets knocked into another playable character, it'll take another direct hit from that character and fly a little further. With each successive hit, the additional damage on the enemy increases, meaning if you can get an enemy into a situation where they're rapidly bouncing off things such as the arena wall, you can deal monstrous amounts of damage in just a single turn. There's an additional wrinkle in the mix too: super knockback. This occurs at random, deals considerably more damage, and sends the enemy much further at a massively higher velocity, making it much more likely they'll bang into things. What the game doesn't tell you is that you can trigger one of these at will with a well-timed press of the confirm button during the knockback animation. Not only that, but any additional hits from your party members can also be super knockbacks with another well-timed button press. Mastering this ability is important to success in the latter half of the game, and nigh essential if you're playing on the hard difficulty, which is why it's odd the game doesn't tell you about it explicitly. Indeed, if you don't use super knockback effectively, some fights against tougher monsters and mini-bosses can drag on for a very long time indeed. This isn't necessarily a major issue except during the game's finale sequence, where one specific fight must be beaten within 5 complete combat rounds to ensure you get the true ending, otherwise things end rather worse than you might perhaps like. One interesting thing about combat is that your playable characters are fairly consistently squishy throughout the entire game, even if you considerably outlevel the enemies you're fighting. Critical hits, for example, ignore characters' defense. This means that combat is always a risky business, even when playing a New Game Plus run, and helps prevent the game from becoming nothing more than mindless spamming of the attack button. There is an auto battle function for the truly lazy, but if you want battles to be won safely and efficiently, you'll want to take manual control and fully embrace the super knockback mechanics. Death End Request 2's narrative proceeds at a fairly deliberate pace, as in most visual novel style RPGs. Each in-game day feels like noticeable progress though, with important events that help to flesh out the setting occurring in the daytime, and new areas to explore being revealed at night. Combat encounters are consistently interesting and engaging, and the intriguing nature of the story, whether you're a newcomer or a Death End Request veteran, is sufficient incentive to keep you playing for hours at a time. While it is not only unashamedly Japanese but also unashamedly niche interest in its style, structure and subject matter, Death End Request 2 is a great example of why I like Compile Heart and Idea Factory so much. It's that specific laser focus on what it wants to achieve that appeals to me so much. This is a game that knows exactly what it is, and isn't going to change itself to appeal to the masses or get a better result from a focus group. It's a game that has been clearly designed with a clear creative vision in terms of structure, narrative and mechanics, and it invites you to engage with it on your own terms if you think you're up for it. If you're not, it doesn't care. It is what it is, it's proud of what it is, and it knows it'll have people who find it appealing for one reason or another. It'll no doubt not surprise you to hear that I most definitely fall into that latter category. I enjoyed Death End Request 2 a whole lot, and I'm glad to hear that a third entry is on the way at the time of recording. And so, on that note, it just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.